Hi, I'm Richard Hewison. I'm the treasurer of the Rejoin EU party.
And I think it's very clear what your goal is. I'm guessing it's for us
Absolutely.
to rejoin the EU.
Yes, that's quite up the top list of our policies. We only have the two: Rejoin the EU, and we oppose all forms of bigotry and intolerance. So that's it. The name's on the can. That's us.
That's great news. So if we talk about just quickly how you guys ran in the London elections, it was the mayoral race and it was another one, right?
We did. We did. We stood in the London elections in both 2021 and 2024. In 2021, we stood for both mayor and the assembly list. But in 2024, obviously, the current mayor suddenly had a big conversion to be pro-EU early on in the debate. And of course, the Green Party also were pro-EU. So we only stood in the assembly election this time.
And how did that go?
Pretty well. We maintained our deposit, which was
That is an
first.
achievement, yeah. That's good.
It is. And as a result of that, the BBC had told us beforehand that they designate any party that retains their deposit as a party of significant political influence, significant political support, I should say. So we are now one of 6 parties in London who have that. Not that you'd know it from the BBC's coverage of us in the election so far.
It is. They've not done great, I think, with the smaller parties. I know there are a lot of them, but I think they should have given something, like some sort of platform, I think, to the smaller parties, especially with, did you win any seats at the mayoral, at the last one?
No. We came 6th out of the 15 parties. There's a minimum limit of 5% of the vote before you get a seat, which intervenes a bit. To put it in context, we got 62,000 votes. The final seat was taken by 81,000 votes.
It's very close,
I believe there. So not a million miles away, but of course the 5% threshold would have meant that although the Conservatives could get the last seat on 81,000, we would have required 125,000.
Right, yeah. It's to keep out fringe parties. That's why they.
It is.
It's very clear. Yeah, Germany did change their PR rules after World War II for obvious reasons. So they did it to keep out fringe, but it does have the negative of keeping out, I think
crackpots like me, yes,
potentially.
I'm not the list.
I'm not making a judgment on that. But
no.
But yeah, I think that's kind of the goal of it. So, what would you say in terms of a plan? If I was going to ask you, like, how do you see things going out? Because obviously you've spoken about the Green Party being pro-EU. I think Sadiq Khan, to be fair to him, has always been pro-EU, and I think as mayor he realises he can be a bit more vocal on certain things because he's not as bound to the the central party. He's pushing free school meals for kids in London as well. And he's a lot more progressive than Sir Keir Starmer.
Indeed.
So I think we'll be fair to him, I think. But how do you see it? Because you've got the Green Party who are obviously pro EU. You've got
well, they are, but they were very quiet about it at the election launch, and you really have to hunt to find it on the manifesto, which is a bit disappointing. If anything, I won't say pleasantly surprised, but a little bit more surprised by the Lib Dems actually being slightly more vocal in their launch of their manifesto in highlighting the EU. Obviously, nothing compared to the SNP, who had it as pretty much their number 2 policy.
You do have like different voters. I think with the Green Party, they're focusing more on disaffected Labour voters who want more progressive kind of economic policy. And if you look at what they pushed, it is that with the Lib Dems, I think they're looking at kind of One Nation Tories. Kind of the Theresa May kind of camp to an extent, and I think the ageing demographics as well, because of course they are pushing elderly care amongst other things. So I think their voter base is clear. I think it's older people and One Nation Tories. I think that's what they're looking at. So in terms of kind of where you see your party's kind of place, where do you see yourselves kind of fit in to that landscape? Because of course you are pushing the EU thing first and foremost. Obviously the SNP, it's second for them. Independence is first, and then they can rejoin after. That's their plan. The Green Party, like I said, disaffected Labour voters. How do you see yourselves fitting in?
Well, we're very much, as you say, a one-issue party, because this is the issue which nobody seems to want to talk about in this general election. And even at the hustings that we attend, when we're able to get into the hustings, it's quite difficult to raise it as an issue and engage the other parties in discussion for it. And that's where I see our position being, forcing the other parties to be clear about their hand on the EU. And certainly we've come up against a number of Labour candidates who are clearly very embarrassed by their party's policy and very, very weak endorsement of it, because I think most of them would love to actually say the same things we're doing. And to be frank, being an annoyance to a lot of the candidates who will be in Parliament in the near future, we hope they'll be saying to Keir Starmer, for goodness sake, why can't you be more mature and honest about this particular issue, because other people are.
I agree with that. What we can do is we can split this into two halves. So we can do kind of the English side, I guess, first, and then we can do kind of the look at the EU side of it in kind of a second half of it. It's not going to go on too long, but I think it would just be easier for the viewers to kind of follow it rather than switching between the two. So you kind of see yourselves as putting pressure. So maybe if you did, maybe next time if you are elected to the London Assembly, you can say, why don't we push these kind of policies? It would help, London, because London does need immigration, which is very true. It does need not just obviously hospitality staff or healthcare workers. It needs people across the board. London's a very diverse city. It has a lot of different needs. And obviously one of the things people focus on is mainly hospitality when it's finance, law, all the other things that make the city of London effectively. Absolutely. Trade and services as well, which I think that will start to die down slowly as the EU kind of tries to take away as much of the clearinghouses as possible. So in terms of, you see yourselves as kind of a pressure party in a sense of you're looking to try and get elected, or at least put pressure on elected officials.
Well, very, very much so. And one of the reasons we argued for one of the seats on the London Assembly quite strongly is not so much that the other parties are totally anti thinking about the EU. It's just that they'll never propose anything on it. If we'd got a seat on the London Assembly, we would have put to the Assembly the idea of consulting London again to see how it now felt about Brexit. And for all the wonderful things that Green Party and Lib Dem party representatives might try to do on the London Assembly, they would never propose something like that. But if it's proposed in front of them, they may well have supported it on the Assembly. Right. And certainly it would have put a lot of pressure on the Assembly to actually come out of the closet and discuss it, particularly, of course, the Labour representatives.
I can't understand that the parties don't want to make the first move because they're obviously scared of the backlash. Of course, London voted Remain and is quite a progressive city. Typically votes kind of Labour.
Exactly.
And so that does make sense as a start, but you do fall into the kind of metropolitan elite tag of, of course, London wants to, vote to Remain and things like that. Of course, they want immigrants. What about rural communities, all that kind of stuff. So how do you combat that kind of narrative?
To be frank, we're standing 26 candidates in this election. 14 of them are within the Greater London area. And although of the other 12, some of them are fairly close to the Greater London area, we are covering other areas. We've got candidates in Sheffield, candidates in Oxford, candidates in Kent. So we've got candidates all over the country. We're standing in Preston as well, for example, there. Very much the proposition would be, if one of us got elected to Parliament, then the way that we can best advance the cause of the EU is, again, to do a private members bill on the subject of reconsulting the UK about Brexit. Now, again, this would never be a priority for any of the other parties if elected. But if a private members bill was put before Parliament, based on consulting the UK again about rejoining the EU, I think even a very solid Labour majority, Sir Keir might find a lot of pressure to keep his MPs from voting in favour of that.
I think it would depend on the constituencies, because I've seen, covered, I cover current affairs, and Lisa Nandy was talking about how kind of EU healthcare workers took jobs away from her constituents, and I'm like, what do you, how do you figure that one? And I will let you respond to that, actually, because it does move on to a further point.
About the 650 MPs that we might get to support ourselves, I think Lisa Nandy is right over in the final 100 that we would never expect to be coming on board in the next Parliament.
In terms of that, though, how do you convince people? I think this is one of the key things that I've kind of debated with people in the past is, how do you convince people in Britain freedom of movement is a positive? Because we've watched, I don't know if you followed the debate between Starmer and Sunak. You had Sunak keep saying,
I did.
we're all worse off for it, that debate there. I've lost IQ points. I don't know how you felt about that. Gave me a headache.
It was very, very disillusioning. And although I'm not sure I entirely agreed with the angle the audience member was coming from, the idea of, are these two really the best that we've got, It is very, very. Let's be frank. Let's deal with that point first of all.
Sure.
Not only is Sunak not one of the best in the country, he's not even one of the best in the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party, we now have a rump left of the least talented politicians they've ever had, because anyone with any backbone, any common sense, any decency has left the Conservative Party a long time ago in terms of where we are.
Or they were pushed out. It's not just they left; they were pushed out. Forced out.
I mean, the 2019 intake really was a massive lobotomy job by Boris Johnson, getting rid of anyone that opposed him, which has left them in a very weak position now. But let's talk about the issue of immigration head on, and the disappointing lack of honesty there is in the debate. Let's just talk about it clinically and unemotionally. We have a hugely aging population bubble. We now have all of our baby boomers heading into retirement, and as early Generation X, I'm not far behind there, and that is a huge inactive economic bunch of people at the top of the society who are relying on a young workforce to support their precious triple lock pension. And that is what they need. We have a reproductive rate that, even with the most generous recent figures, is still languishing at 1.75, obviously meaning that we for every 8 people we have in this generation, we have 7 in the next. We need immigration. We need young, enthusiastic, keen workers joining the workforce in order to sustain this demographic bubble. And the idea that, the population has gone up by several million over since 2010, but that's not going to carry on in the future. And immigration is the only thing that is going to keep us steady. So we need positive immigration. And ironically, when you look roughly at the number of immigrants we need to attract into the UK, it's around about 600,000 a year, which is kind of at the level that we're at, that everyone is complaining, oh my goodness, this is unsustainable. So I really think we need some honesty in the immigration debate. And if we can't persuade people just out of common decency that the people fleeing the war zones that we've been largely responsible for helping establish, either directly through political intervention or indirectly through the arms that we've provided, then just look at your own well-being. We need immigrants in this country.
So in terms of, that's the logic argument, but in terms of the emotional argument, which is the main one that they make, I remember I covered a Channel 4 clip in the Costa del Sol, where one guy was saying, I thought they would keep freedom of movement for the proper Europeans. So I think he was talking about, Spain, Italy, potentially France, Germany, Scandinavian countries, predominantly white Western Europeans. So how do you combat that? Because I know that age group is aging off, but as we saw in the debate, with the gentleman who talked about securing borders and all this kind of stuff, it's very clear that regardless of the economics of it, which you've stated there, very clear that we need people to come in. How do you deal with the emotion angle? Because politics is an emotional game. That's the thing people forget. And how do you explain to those people that especially when they say, well, my kid can't get a place in school because of immigrants, I can't go to hospital because of immigrants, I stubbed my toe on a tree because of immigrants. How do you explain to that person? Because they are aging out, you are correct, but at the same time you still have kind of, not, I don't want to say it in a derogatory term, your generation, but there is still that age group after the baby boomers who still, I think, hold some of those beliefs, and they will be the next, I think, key voter demographic after the baby boomers. How do you convince those people? Because for me, I think personally, for freedom of movement is the key stumbling block to a lot of people for wanting to have EU membership. And this is something I spoke about a couple of years ago, where I said this will be the stumbling block, because inherently I think there are a decent amount of English voters who would say, I would have to be poorer if it meant there's less immigrants here. Because just last thing I should say, because during the referendum, people are saying there's going to be more black and brown people like me coming here and less kind of Europeans, and they were like, we'll just stop all of them. But that didn't happen, because the economic angle is you need people to come here. Do you see what I'm saying? So
I do. I'm sorry to sort of. I'm not laughing to make sure. I'm laughing because you're absolutely right when you hear these. But the thing is, well, first of all, I am a person rooted in logic rather than emotion, I have to say, in general. So when it comes to trying to persuade people who are emotionally wedded to these ideas, it's something that I think people have to come around to. But secondly, the thing is, we actually have won the argument, and we've won it a long time ago. And if we had a referendum tomorrow, 2/3 of the population, roughly, would vote to rejoin the EU. And that has been true for at least the last 2 years. And I'm quite convinced that if you take any period after the referendum in 2016 and ask the population properly what they think, you would find that the majority, a clear majority, would vote to rejoin the EU and vote to restore freedom of movement. So I do think we are talking about a minority, a vocal minority, but nonetheless a minority still. And you can challenge me with all the anecdotal evidence that you like, and I'll say, okay, let's put it to the test. Let's have another referendum and see, because I'm pretty convinced of the way that referendum would go.
So to end kind of this half of it almost, you saw yesterday, obviously, Starmer saying, I'm not going to return to the EU and freedom of movement. I'm not going to get a better deal. And you had Sunak saying, the only way he's going to get a better deal is with freedom of movement. And you can see the audience kind of, I think, applauding Sunak for that. And so the audience was very much, fair enough, the BBC kind of biased audience. But if you see what I'm saying, I think outside of campaign season, you can say, we will get freedom of movement for goods and things like that. But I think in a campaign season, when you've got like a Nigel Farage type figure talking about, Romanians and Bulgarians, which he did last time, I think he's gonna say is, look, immigration's at 600,000 now. It's gonna be even higher with freedom of movement, if you see what I'm saying. And that's because the thing with logic is, you can kind of figure these things out and realize most of what he's saying isn't true. But once you appeal to emotion, that's when logic goes out the window and you're not thinking with your brain. You're thinking, oh my God, some Romanian guy's going to move next door and he might rob me or something, which is completely nonsense. It's complete nonsense, especially when you want to look at, building houses. We need people to come here because our trade schools are a joke.
Absolutely. Yeah,
our apprenticeship schemes are awful. Like, they don't pay properly. But that's what I mean. Like, those are the people you're still, I think, going to have to convince, because in a campaign, that's the issue that's going to come up. And if you don't, you're either going to lose or it's going to be a lot closer than you want it to be, if you see what I'm saying. So that's kind of the point of, how do you still combat that? Or because we, as stupid as it is, we can't really laugh at them, because that's what happened last time. We laughed. Rejoin has Remainers kind of laughed, mocked them, and said, "Oh, these people are racist and whatever." And in the end, they got the last laugh, because they're like, "Your pressure free movement is gone. Free movement of goods gone. People, services, all of it is gone. We won." And they won it based on emotion. There was no logic in what they said. Wow. And that's what I mean. That's my final question on this before we go to the EU side. How do you try and convince them still? Because you're going to have to convince some of them at least to get there.
I think if we look at the margin of victory, 1/3 already of the 52% who voted have been convinced. And the easiest way to convince them is to see the results. And I think many people are seeing the results. I want to talk briefly about the clapping for Sunak and his points in that debate. And you mentioned almost jokingly the BBC bias in the audience. They were actually quite open about how they'd done the audience. 50% of the audience that weren't undecided were Conservative voters. 50% were Labour voters. Now, of course, we know from the polls that that's not the current split. The current split is much more 2/3, 1/3 if you're just taking the Labour-Conservative divide there. Labour already have twice the support of the Conservative Party on virtually every poll that you see. So that audience was not representative of the current breakdown of where the polls tell us that the electorate are. But you are totally right about having to emotionally engage people in wanting to embrace the world. The problem is, I think the emotion ultimately has to be based with facts. And quite frankly, people like myself and our party have been utterly invisible over the last 4.5 years of this government. And try as we might to get airtime, we're not. And the only way to challenge a burst of emotion on a hot Thursday next week is 4 years of logical preparation leading up to that, in my view. Coldly, calmly, rationally explaining the case for freedom of movement. And I have to say, in terms of pressing emotional buttons, there are much better politicians than me for that. And I wish some of them would step forward and take more leadership on this particular issue.
I think that's fair, but I think that's something your party are going to have to address at some point. Or maybe you can bring people in who are, I think maybe Alex might be good at it as well, someone who can appeal a bit to emotions as well, because that's how parties succeed in it, ultimately. You do need that aspect of it. It can't be all cold hard logic, because
we try.
We're a country that elected Boris Johnson. The only thing he did was appeal to emotion. And so he won ultimately. So if we flip to the EU angle, in terms of rejoining, the EU have been clear that it's a settled issue in Britain. They need to see things change here. But also, how do you see that playing out? Because obviously you're going to need unanimous consent of all the EU member states. We've built up a lot of bad blood with some of these EU member states, some of the things we've said, some of the things we've done. How do you kind of see that playing out? because EU countries have taken business away from us, and they might see that as a detriment. People in Germany might say, well, we've taken manufacturing away a bit, we've taken financial services. Frankfurt's doing a bit better potentially. France can say Paris is doing better. The Netherlands as well doing better in services. They can say, we're taking all your business. You're still buying from us, and you're not selling as much to us anymore. So why do we really want you back in?
Well, first of all, it would be for the EU one of the most massive PR coups of all time to see the recalcitrant black sheep come gently nudging back into the pen. So I actually think it's overstated how much opposition there would be. Having said that, of course, it would have been far easier in the last 5 years without some of the shall we say, rather eccentric people that are rising to the top in some countries within the EU at the moment, which unfortunately is a trend that looks like it will continue for the short while. The bottom line is, and one of the big debates we often have within our party, and I hear within other pro-EU parties, is exactly how we would do it, what route we would do, what step we would do first, how it would come about. The bottom line is it's not going to happen until we take the first step with another referendum. And much as I understand how referendums are used to radicalize and galvanize populations into very populist views, we are still suffering from the 2016 referendum and how it opened the doors to, let's be honest, quite open racism in many parties
open.
there.
It was very open, yeah. So,
but all I would say is we have to, unfortunately, have another one to start the process. And whatever route you are taking back to the EU, it has to start with a referendum, and it has to start with winning a referendum. And I think the repositioning of players both sides of the channel once that referendum has happened, I am quite confident it would have a 2/3 majority for Remain, Oblique, Rejoin. If we were to do so, then I think people's positions will start to change.
I think what we would have to see is a very much less toxified conversation around immigration. I think that's where it will start. That's where the issue really, I think, arose from. In terms of the members, it would be the greatest of ironies if Romania blocked our ascension to the EU. The most ironic potentially thing that could happen. But like I said, it could be any one of them, and so it is going to be difficult. But I agree. It does start. That conversation does start here in, I think, England predominantly, and then it can move on from there. Do you see the UK lasting long enough to rejoin the EU? Because Scotland potentially looking at leaving, they could join faster than us. They could block our ascension if they wanted to. That would be another ironic thing to happen, but
they could. I doubt they would, but they certainly could. I mean, the major parties in Scotland and a lot of the major parties in Northern Ireland are both in favour of, as you say, leaving the UK and doing it. I think the UK is in for a very turbulent time over the next 5 years. One of the things that has really disappointed me over the last 4.5 years is how a lot of people who share views similar to my own have basically written Keir Starmer a blank check for promises he can't deliver in the next 5 years. And there are so many people whose mental horizons don't go beyond July the 5th next week. Well, July the 5th is coming, and it's going to be a shock to it. Once you sober up from the party, having destroyed the Conservatives, great. But then you have a Labour Party that has no direction in which to go to and can only let people down over the next 5 years.
I agree 100% of that, yeah. And I think that's a very dangerous place it puts the UK in, because I think that's where the far right will, I think, really ultimately win. I think what I'd want to say is, with the EU side of it, kind of the veto, they're going to want to see a much more positive side of the UK, I think, in terms of, fundamental change in beliefs and things like that, which will happen with demographics. But also, I think people like yourself will have to kind of show people the benefits of it, I guess. I don't know if you agree with that.
I do agree with that, but it disappoints me, that particular view, because I see our electorate as roughly 50 million sovereign individuals who should be able to look at the facts as presented to them and understand where our best way forward is. Now, I do agree that the team aiming for a Rejoin position needs to be a lot more articulate than the Remain team were in 2016.
Oh, awful.
this is where I think we need to hopefully lure our more skilled communicators out of the closet and get them back onto the trail. Because the sad thing is, a lot of the people who were loud, eloquent, positive voices in the 2016 to 2019 period have just given up. I think. I mean, they won't say that, but they've just given up. They just say, you know what?
Well, to be fair, there's no place for them in kind of the current political landscape, because Starmer is very much not, despite him being a Remainer, he's very much gone the other way and saw his political success lie within Brexit. If you look at the two major parties, they're two pro-Brexit parties ultimately. Make Brexit work, and Brexit is great. The Lib Dems, I think, are the ones that could potentially push the conversation along with the Greens, but I think it's going to be very difficult for them to do so, because that one nation Tory kind of mentality, I don't know if they would be pro-immigration, if you see what I'm saying. So that might be a difficult bridge for them to get, difficult bridge for them, potentially. I just want to see what's your kind of role, like, I guess, with the party, because ultimately this is kind of not a plea to get votes, but this is kind of your chance to put a statement out to some people. Like, my channel's not that big, but it's kind of your way to say, like, how do you see your party kind of trying to influence and push? As you mentioned before, if you were there elected in the London Assembly, you would have been there pushing for it. How do you see your role kind of post-election?
Well, one of the great things about the London Assembly election, the nicest thing, and I won't say who it was, but the nicest thing in the election was one of the fairly senior people elected afterwards coming up to us and saying they wished we didn't exist. And that's where I would like to be. Not only would I like for our party not to exist, I'd like there to be no need for us to exist, which it's probably quite rare amongst parties. I don't understand why the Liberal Democrats are not running with this banner absolutely streaming, because the Lib Dems, in theory, have two of the most positive policies in terms of electoral support, rejoining the EU and proportional representation, both of which poll well into the 60s, now coming on to 70s%, and yet for most of this parliament, they've languished around 8-9% of the opinion polls. Now, as I say, one thing that did encouraged me a little bit was how prominent particularly the EU was in their manifesto launch. And I don't think there's a coincidence that manifesto launch was linked with an uptick of 3 to 4 points. In fact, one poll doubled their support almost overnight as a result of that. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, increased it by 50% overnight as a result of that. Whereas when the Greens launched their manifesto and blatantly avoided those issues, there was no uptick for them.
Yeah, I have been very surprised that their polling has been very much around the 6% mark. It's very strange, that is, because when I look at their policy, I'm like, oh, these are great, but they have had limited screen time as well, which as we said, the media does kind of push out smaller pies. I think that's why social media is so important, because as myself and people like Alex and Max and Phil and all these people, we can attest to is it's organic, and we can push out our own kind of ideas and see where it puts us. So I think that's the great thing of it, and I think being more active on social media will help. But I think we've mentioned that you see yourself kind of, your party is more of a pressure party, which I think is great, because we do need to shift that over to the window back to the other side. And I think if you're going to say to the voters, why should they vote for your party, given that chance of electoral success in terms of winning a seat, how do you see that?
Well, one of the things I have to say, it's not that I have a sense of pride about it, but I reflect on it philosophically. This will be my 10th general election. Now, I've voted in the previous 9 general elections with my conscience for the party that I thought would best lead the country forward. And on all 9 occasions, I've not voted for the party that's formed the government or even been part of the government. And quite frankly, that kind of gives me the moral position to say, well, nothing that's happened is my moral responsibility. I've always striven, when I use my vote, to try to use it for what I thought was the best outcome for society. Now, I understand that a lot of people have this sort of winner's mentality. Oh, I feel good because I vote for the winning party. But if you use your moral authority for a program you don't believe in, then how has that helped you? And this is where I think a lot of people are going to find themselves with huge buyer's remorse after Labour are elected, because the worst thing about this election is how many people who I know feel as strongly as me about the European issue are now going to literally vote for Brexit next Thursday, because they're going to vote for a Brexit party. And the point is, one vote it will never make a mathematical difference to the outcome, but it will make a difference to your own personal moral authority and where you actually put it. And if you are pro-EU, in the entire period between January the 1st, 2020 and December the 31st, 2028, the only time you will have influence on that is on July the 4th, 2024, when you go and cast your ballot. And if you choose to cast your ballot for Brexit, then, what have you done this entire decade?
Because a vote is an endorsement of policy at the end of the day. You can deny it all you want, but you're putting your name, you are voting for that person. Even if you're voting against something else, you're still voting for someone. And I think that's one of the things where people kind of fail to understand that point. So, if we kind of wrap this up, what would you say your, kind of not your promises, but what would you say, in terms of supporting your party, but also the broader movement? How do you see the timescale for joining the EU and stuff like that? We'll just quickly wrap up on that. Sorry.
I think we've got one of two very dark paths ahead of us, to be frank. Next Thursday is almost certainly going to put an unassailable majority for Keir Starmer's Brexit party into power for potentially 5 years. I think Labour are going to find it impossible over the next 5 years to deliver anything close to what people are expecting. Yep. And I expect over the next 5 years there to be a very, very disillusioned fallout. Now, unfortunately, there's a hard right party, which we know is waiting in 2029 to take over if they possibly can. So it's how we manage the process over the next 5 years of Labour disillusionment that will determine whether we get anywhere close to rejoining the EU. Now, in a way, I'd like to believe what some of the right wing are telling us, because I often have debates with people saying, oh, if you vote Keir Starmer, you're going to get Brexit by the back door. And I'm thinking, if I thought that for 1 minute, I'd be voting Keir Starmer. Sorry, reverse Brexit by the back door, I should say.
Yeah, you got to be careful with that.
If I thought that for 1 minute, then I'd be right behind Keir Starmer. But I don't believe that. So we have this really weird thing where people like me are saying, Keir Starmer's said what he's going to do with the EU, don't vote for it, and people on the right are saying, oh, he's going to do exactly the reverse, don't vote for it.
It's because of his record, isn't it? If you look at who he was kind of pre-leadership and post-leadership, I think that's what people, because he does talk about, he was in charge of the CPS and things like that. I think that's one of the key things. And I agree, I think there shouldn't be a situation where people try and vote shame you into voting a specific way. You should vote with your conscience. And if your conscience is that you have a particularly nasty Tory MP who you can get rid of via tactile voting, why not? But if you're in a constituency where it is a toss-up,
live with the moral consequences of that. Say to yourself, I think Brexit and keeping first past the post is more important to me than allowing this Conservative to continue to exist. If that's your view, fine, but take moral responsibility.
I agree.
That's the thing that
I agree, and I think you should have the guts to write to the MP and say, look, I'm voting for you, not because I'm pro your policies, but because I don't like the other lot. But next time, I might not be there. Next time, I might vote for someone else, because fundamentally these are the things that I want, and if you're not going to give me any of those, it's not enough to say, we're not the Tories. It's you've had your shot, you've had 5 years now. What have you delivered? Nothing.
But equally, that MP is perfectly entitled to write back to them and say, well, you saw the manifesto I stood on. This was the promise I made to you. And how dare you say this to me? You're anti-democratic. I've got a democratic mandate to do exactly what is in this manifesto. Who are you to try blackmailing me afterwards in saying, I voted for you, but I didn't really mean it. I wanted you to do this. Tough. That was the contract that you've got.
That is a really valid point, especially since Labour are very firm on first past the post. I'm out of focus now, but Keir Starmer, fundamentally is committed to first past the post. I don't know how to fix this. Can I fix it?
Which is ridiculous, because Labour Party policy in favour of PR was overwhelming last time it came up in the in their conference. And although, if I remember rightly, his line at the time was, it's not a priority, in inverted commas. So not support for first past the post, but it's not a priority. The other thing which on PR, just to sort of digress briefly, which does concern me, is I'm not hearing how people plan to deal with the fallout from the 2011 referendum, because that one, unlike the 2016 one, was a legally binding referendum to give us first past the post. So I'm not entirely sure what steps have to actually be taken to reverse effectively that referendum.
I think that one will be that's done. I think they would have to do a new one. They could do a new one where they could, because it was over a decade ago under a different, a coalition government, with it wasn't even a manifesto really. It was just a joint kind of policy proposal. So I think they could redo that one fairly easily. Like, one act of parliament can unpeel another act of parliament. So I don't think that would be a big deal. But I think if we do closing statements, is there anything you want to really say to the voters or to England, I guess?
Only to re-emphasise what we've just said. Look, this is the one time in the 20s that you will have a say in the political direction of this country. And I know most people already have made up their mind. And one vote will not change the sway of where everyone else is going. But it states your moral position, your moral responsibilities. And if you believe, like I believe, that we really need to be re-engaging with the world, we can't just sit on our remote island while climate change devastates our planet. We need to be actively involved. We need to be pooling together our resources with our nearest neighbours. And if you believe that, like I do, then obviously I would recommend you vote for a Rejoin EU candidate in the 26 constituencies that we're standing in. And where we're not standing, I'd urge you to look very carefully at what the parties are promising.
Yeah, if you look at the parties that are most likely to win, say for example, if you're in Bristol Central, I think that's the Green Party, or if you're in the Lib Dem kind of marginals, you look at the Lib Dems, because that will help shift the conversation to an extent towards the direction that we're looking to go in.
There's other great small parties who are pro EU out there as well. There's Volt UK standing some candidates. There's the True and Fair Party standing candidates as well, all very, very pro EU.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because at the end of the day, you do have to appeal to voters to win. It's not just enough to be not the Tories. And I agree with that. And I think after this election, I think we'll see, because, like we mentioned before, there is a cap on success for the Labour Party in terms of being outside the EU for manufacturing, for services, for agriculture. There is a limit because you have to do trade. You can't be a successful exporting country without having really strong trade links to your neighbours, because who you can export the stuff to. The paperwork will be a nightmare unless you have really unique goods, and we don't have that bar the services we have.
Yeah. I totally agree.
And this has been a really wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for putting it out there. Really appreciate that.
That's fine. I'll get it out before the election. I'll try and get it out before the weekend. Thanks for Political X for setting this one up as well. I really appreciate him kind of having an influence in this. And we'll end it there. Thank you for your time.
Great to meet you. Bye-bye.
Bye.